Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode number 4 of My Journey with Jesus. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. My name is Dave Little, and I am honored to have you all checking out this broadcast about my Christian walk. And it's been great over the first 3 episodes to have so many folks respond so enthusiastically. Folks from uh, life who are my friends, folks from the gaming community, folks who catch the broadcast just passing through on YouTube. Thank you all for checking things out, and thank you for the new subscribers who have joined the channel over the past week. And today's topic is rational faith, why I believe in the Christian message. Last week we talked about what I believe and walked through the basics of the principles of the Christian faith. Today we're going to talk about why I choose to believe those things. The short answer is that I believe the message of Christianity and I believe the Bible because it is the most rational explanation of the pivotal events of history. And tonight I will cite 3 examples of events that have been personally meaningful to me as I examined the validity of the Christian faith. And we talked about this back in episode 1, how I accepted the Christian faith as a child. I believe I was 8 years old when that took place, when I had that discussion with my father. And subsequently, when I became an adult, I had to re-examine all that and make my own decision as to whether I was going to believe in Christianity for myself and follow that message. And tonight we're going to talk about the reasons why I chose to do that. And the first explanation, the first example is the example of creation, where it all began. Where did we come from? Where did humanity come from? Where did the earth come from? That is a question that everyone has pondered. When we look at the earth, the sky, the universe, it's always been my sense that all of this has to be the result of a creative force rather than just random chance. I could do a whole stream on that question alone, and perhaps one day I will. But early in my exploration of my beliefs, I became convinced that the existence of a creator is the most rational explanation for the universe and for humanity as a whole. I heard a great analogy about this a couple of weeks ago as I was watching some things on YouTube. I ran across a video made by a man by the name of Mark Lowry. Mark Lowry is a Christian musician and also a Christian comedian, was part of the Gaither vocal band for many years. And he talked in his video about a brand new watch that he had bought. And he loved this watch, and it was the coolest watch he'd ever had, and he's wearing it around, and he's showing it off. And he says, suppose I took this watch off, and suppose I took it apart and put all of the parts into a plastic baggie, a sandwich bag, ziplocked, and I took all these loose watch parts and I stuck them in this bag, and I shook it up, and I shook and I shook and I shook that bag for a day, a minute, a week, a year. Sooner or later, do you think a watch, I could reach into this bag and take out the watch? A fully constructed, fully functional, fully working watch, the way that it had been before I disassembled it and put it in this plastic bag? What are the odds of that? If you're going to believe that a person can take apart a watch, stick the parts in a plastic baggie, shake it up, and expect it to reassemble itself, believing in that possibility takes an awful lot of faith. You got to have faith to believe that this watch can put itself back together. Same thing is true for the universe, the earth, the human body. To look at something as complex as the human body and just try and imagine that this happened all by itself without some sort of creative force behind it, to me is very difficult to conceive of. This really hit home for me in 1983, the first time I set foot in the cadaver lab as a freshman medical student. I had a friend on Facebook once ask me, you're such a scientist, you've got, 3 college degrees all in science and related fields. How can you intellectually still hold on to the notion that there's a God when you're such a scientist? And the cadaver lab was the proof of that, because the first time I opened up that cadaver and saw the miracle of what the human body is and the complexity of it, and how all the parts fit together, and how the heart pumped the blood and the blood went to the lungs and the blood went to the brain, and all of this was connected by nerves and muscles and blood vessels and all this other stuff. I just looked at that and went, whoa. And to me, looking at the cadaver was the most God-affirming experience that I've ever had. Just to see how complex and how fearfully and wonderfully made the human body is. The notion that this randomly occurred all by itself as a result of universal molecular happenstance, that view would take a lot of faith. It would take an awful lot of faith to believe that this creation and the human body just spontaneously created itself, or evolved out of itself out of a single cell in a primordial ooze somewhere. That explanation takes a lot of faith. And it's much more rational in my mind to put my faith in the existence of the Creator. One more example of this happened to me in 1996, when I went with a couple of friends and visited the city of Houston. And we saw the NASA space station in Houston. And I remember just the immensity, the enormity of the NASA scientific complex. They had these huge vacuum tubes where they simulated all of the conditions that they were going to explore when they sent their equipment out into space. And they had building after building after building of laboratories and test labs and monitoring. And we couldn't get in to see all of it, because this was the point in time, I believe, when the first motorized exploration vehicle was deployed to Mars, and there were people in rooms watching the transmissions that the little cameras were sending back from Mars. And it just really struck me that what I was looking at was, in this NASA space complex, the pinnacle of human wisdom. This was the most spectacular intellectual achievement that mankind is capable of. And viewed through the eyes of God, it was like we had gone from the third knuckle to the fourth knuckle in exploring God's creation. And it was the pinnacle of human wisdom for us to get there. So the fact that there's this whole big universe out there, and the notion that within this whole big universe there exists a creative force that gave rise to that whole universe, to me is a very rational conclusion. So that's example number 1. Example number 2, who is Jesus? What do we know about Jesus from history? We know that he was a guy who lived. He was a real guy. He probably didn't look like the fair-skinned, blue-eyed, handsome man in most of the photographs that we see, or most of the portraits that we see. We don't have any photographs of Jesus, but we've got a lot of historical and eyewitness accounts that document his existence. We have historical documentation from eyewitness testimony to a number of miracles that Jesus performed. Supernatural, events that give credence to the notion that Jesus was a supernatural being. On top of that, Jesus was a great moral teacher. His moral teachings have transcended time and transcended religion. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the other moral teachings, moral principles that Jesus laid out there are things that are universally recognized as great moral teachings. And yet at the same time, this great moral teacher claimed to be God. And that's a claim that deserves investigation. Was Jesus God? Are we willing to consider the possibility that Jesus is God? We've seen the supernatural miracles that he was able to perform. Healing the sick, walking on water, raising Lazarus from the dead. At the same time, he was a great moral teacher and he claimed to be God. What if he wasn't God? If he wasn't God, maybe he was a pathological liar who realized he wasn't God but claimed to be God anyways. Or maybe he was somebody who claimed to be God and really didn't know that he wasn't God. Maybe he was a crazy, insane maniac. Or maybe he was God. Which of those explanations is most rational? That this great moral teacher who performed historically documented miracles was really a lunatic who just did all this great stuff and taught all this great stuff and at the same time thought he was God? Who else thinks they're God? David Koresh thought he was God. He was a crazy maniac. Maybe he was just a pathological liar. But how could he be such a pathological liar and a great moral teacher at the same time? It takes a lot of extrapolation and, quite honestly, a lot of faith to put your trust in that explanation of the identity of Jesus. Or you can take the view that his great moral teachings and his historically documented supernatural miracles support his claims to be God. And that's a rational viewpoint if you're going to come to this debate with no presuppositions that, God doesn't exist or that man could not do these things or this stuff didn't happen, by any other rational analysis. If you accept the possibility that Jesus was God on par with the other possibilities, it's a perfectly rational conclusion. Example number 3. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Once again, we have multiple eyewitness accounts that assert that Jesus rose from the dead. Is that a rational conclusion? Maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he was on the cross being crucified and he just fainted. And so they stuck him in the tomb and he woke up later and rolled the stone away and got away on his own. Do you believe that? Is that a rational conclusion? There was a JAMA article, Journal of the American Medical Association, published an article in 1986 called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. And physicians analyzed the historic accounts of everything that happened to Jesus in the final hours of his life. The beatings, the blood loss, the time he spent on the cross, the mechanism by which crucifixion would lead to death. People who got crucified died of suffocation because they could no longer breathe. Because after a while you have to lift yourself up by the legs in order to expand your torso to breathe. And so they broke Jesus' legs so that he couldn't do that and he would die faster. Then they stuck a spear in his side and ruptured his spleen. So if you want to posit the explanation that Jesus survived all that, rested in the tomb for 3 days with no food, no water, got up with the strength to push the gigantic boulder away from the face of the tomb and escape under his own power, that's a pretty bold claim to put your faith in. Is that really a rational belief compared to Jesus rose from the dead? Maybe the disciples, this swarthy group of 12 uneducated men, many of whom scattered at the death of Jesus at the cross, came back and united their forces and overpowered a battalion of Roman guards and stole the body. Yeah, no. I don't consider that a very rational explanation either. So, did Jesus rise from the dead? I think that is the most rational explanation for the recorded events of history. That Jesus was crucified, died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, and 3 days later that tomb was found to be empty. What more rational explanation could there be? All right, we're at the 15-minute mark. So I'll just wrap up by saying, I see the hand of God in creation. Jesus presented himself to the world as God. He was a deeply thoughtful, moral, righteous man, performed supernatural miracles, and rose from the dead. If he's not God of the universe, the Son of the God of the universe, what other explanation is there that's more rational? If you want to explore these ideas further, I'll recommend a book by Josh McDowell called More Than a Carpenter. I mentioned Josh on episode 1 as a man who was an academic skeptic who set out to research the claims of the Christian faith in an effort to refute those claims, and as a result of his investigation came to the conclusion that the most rational explanation for the biblical record is that Jesus is who he says he is. Jesus was who he says he was, the Son of God, a supernatural being who came to earth, performed supernatural acts, died on the cross, and rose from the dead. He published 2 or 3 volumes of his research notes called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I've looked at that extensively. It's kind of like reading an encyclopedia. It's not a very good read. More Than a Carpenter is a very short read, not more than, well, I've got a copy of it here in front of me. I'll flip the monitor back over to me. Here's More Than a Carpenter. It reads, not including the references, it reads 120 pages, little paperback. So if you're interested in learning more about the rational basis for the Christian faith, I highly recommend More Than a Carpenter. And with that, I will wrap up. So thank you everybody for listening and watching. Feel free to leave your questions and your comments below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you want to see more, hit that little subscribe button. And the little alarm bell next to the little subscribe button will activate your notifications so that you will learn each time that we come onto the channel. And thank you all for checking this out. We'll see you next week. And until then, God bless you all and go in peace.